Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk about, I'm actually going to focus a bit more on solutions because from what I've heard from Beth and Ross, you've already heard a lot about the problems, and I'm going to try and be a bit more positive and upbeat. But I'm going to talk more about the sort of big picture macroeconomic problems than about, I think, most of the other solutions you've been hearing about at this conference, which are much more focused at the community level. NEF does both. We try and do the big picture stuff, but also try and support communities on the ground to make change really happen. But I'm going to focus, because this is really where my expertise lies, more on the big picture stuff. But I will start off with the problem rather than the solution, I'm afraid, which we've tried to encapsulate in this chart here, which essentially shows a positive feedback cycle, which is also, of course, negative because it's unsustainable and could also be thought of as a doom loop in the sense that we have a housing market or housing system driven by not the need to provide shelter adequate for everyone, but driven primarily by expectations of wealth creation and future increases in profits. And that's from both the supply side in terms of this is the model that developers use. They build when they know they will make a certain amount of profit and not in terms of the needs of the population. And also, it also comes from the demand side, where people increasingly see housing not as primarily a place to live for its use value, but primarily because of its market value. Housing is increasingly seen in this country as an asset upon which to build your security, both now and when you're older, to pass on to your children, to give them a step up. And essentially then, housing and underneath it, land has become commoditized or financialized. And key to this process in the UK and many other countries is the role of the financial system and the banking system. And you can see, hopefully from this diagram, hopefully everyone can see it.
Can you read it?
Yeah, I can try and read it out. Can't see it. Maybe if we dim the lights, that might make it a bit clearer. I don't know if that's possible. But anyway, trying to decide where to start. That's the issue with these kind of diagrams. But let's start off with the banking system. Banks in economics textbooks are viewed as intermediaries. They take money from savers and they give it to borrowers. The saver is typically the pensioner or somebody who's saved up over their life cycle, and the borrower is a small business who needs money to invest in a great project. That's not actually how banks work. Banks create money. When a bank makes a loan, it creates an asset and it creates a liability, and the liability is the deposit in your bank account. It doesn't take money from anyone else in the economy. And also, banks don't primarily lend to businesses anymore. They lend to against real estate. They primarily lend against domestic real estate in the form of mortgages or commercial real estate, commercial mortgage real estate, mortgage debt. Or they lend to other financial corporations to buy financial assets. In the UK, only around, depending on whose research you read, it's between about 8 and 10% of all bank lending actually supports productive activity, actually goes to businesses to invest in capital, machinery or distribution or transport. So that's a key initial myth. So when banks make loans against existing real estate, they are extending loans against a finite asset. Land is a finite asset. It's a scarce resource. And the inevitable result of that, assuming there isn't a new supply of housing coming in, is an increase in house prices. That increase in house prices clearly means that more mortgage credit is required for people who don't own homes to get onto the housing market. So it's a self-fulfilling cycle. The more credit is lent, the more people need because house prices are higher. Now, of course, the government could step in here and maybe limit mortgage credit or build more homes, but rather than do that, it's actually subsidised this system, and that's the top right box. Government help to buy schemes, guarantees of house purchase if you can raise a bit of a deposit, and various other subsidies for homeowners, actually. Homeowners receive a huge number of subsidies relative to other forms of tenure. So that creates increasing mortgage debt to even greater extent. We also are facing, as Danny might be talking about in his session, stagnating wages generally in the economy, cuts to the welfare state, cuts to pensions, which all means that the house becomes increasingly important as this source of security and wealth going forwards, which means people are prepared to put even more of their income into buying a house, which further pumps up prices. And then, of course, you have speculative demand from buy-to-let investors, both in the UK and from outside the UK, adding into that. This all leads to an increasing demand for mortgage debt. And the financial deregulation that I think you've heard about already from Beth yesterday, and innovation, enables banks to lend even more. And so it goes on, and we are locked into this cycle, essentially. So how on earth do we get out of it? I'm just going to talk about 4 main options for reform. Ownership, changes to how we understand ownership, changes to taxation, and then I'm going to talk about the financial sector, and finally, just briefly, on actually national accounts, which I think is a really important and sometimes not so well discussed area, but kind of underlies where policy has gone wrong. So to start with ownership, I mean, there's a sort of great assumption that everyone should have a right to own a home in the UK and many other advanced economies. But what's not often sort of forgotten about ownership is it's not just about owning a physical house. It's also owning the land underneath that house. And in doing so, capitalizing the land value, the changes in the value of that land over time, because those are not taxed, essentially, in this country on your primary residence. There is no capital gains tax. So although it's a very nice idea that we all own our own home, it's a much more controversial idea, actually, at least in classical economics, that everyone should simultaneously have the right to the increase in land value from owning that home that comes from the collective improvements made to that area by the wider community, by the state, by the local government, investment in transport and infrastructure. And that is a term called economic rent, when that value goes solely to one individual who happens to own that piece of land within that desirable area. So the alternative to one of the alternatives to private home ownership is public ownership of land, which does not mean the full nationalisation of land and that we live in some communist era where nobody actually has that security that we've got used to. In Singapore, for example, people don't complain about a socialist regime kicking them out of their homes, but 90% of the land is actually owned by the state. The state leases out land on long-term leases and revalues land every 10 or 20 years and gains a huge amount in terms of the taxes it can charge by selling those land leases, 9.1 billion in 2012. And actually income taxes and corporate taxes are very low in Singapore. It's known as a bit of a sort of tax haven. But actually the government gets a huge amount of income from taxing land value uplift. In South Korea, as another example, the Korean Land Corporation controls 50% of residential and controls all commercial land. So essentially it decides what will be built, where, how long the leases will last for, purchases, develop and sells land. The result, at least partially, the result of that is a very different house price to this is house price to income ratio in the UK is in red, and in Korea you can see since the 90s, since before the 90s, the house price to income ratio has actually fallen incredibly in South Korea. So it's becoming progressively cheaper to own a property relative to your income in South Korea than the UK. So there are different options to just pure private home ownership. What would we do in the UK? Well, it's going to be hard to just suddenly, shift to a sort of Singapore-style system for legal reasons, apart from anything else. But at NEF, we've been, and working with Beth as well, actually, we've been thinking about how you might move towards a model where more land is publicly owned, a land bank of some kind, where if there is another crisis, for example, the state could buy up land cheaply, or if there is existing public land where there's danger of it being sold off to developers by local authorities, some sort of national land trust or land bank could buy up that land. Or, most radically, we could even consider policies where future sales of land are sold to the state, maybe at market value, and then the state then allows people to lease that land to live or businesses to work. We already have a freehold leasehold system, but under this sort of proposal, the freehold will be owned collectively rather than by landlords. So those are some of the options on ownership we've been discussing, and it'd be great to debate those more. I'm going to move on to taxation. So many of you may be aware that there is widespread agreement, or universal agreement even, I would say, amongst economists, which is virtually impossible in most in most topics, but there is almost universal agreement. And that, just as there was amongst the classical political economists, such as John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith, and of course Henry George, that the most efficient form of taxation is actually a taxation on the uplift in land value, a land value tax, because this kind of tax, because land is a scarce commodity, no more can be produced if you tax it. It doesn't distort investment decisions. And of course, it brings land that's not being used effectively, where developers or anyone else is just sitting on it. It should bring that land into more productive use. So, recently the IMF, the OECD, the Economist, the Financial Times have all come out, just in the last 5 years and said we need a major structural reform of taxation systems away from income and potentially away from corporation profits as well, actually, and onto land value, the unearned increment in increases in value of land. So if all economists agree on this, what's stopping it from happening? Well, there are practical barriers. In the UK, we have literally no published data on the value of land. Council tax was last valued in 1991, and even council tax is not a valuation of land, it's a valuation of property plus land, so it doesn't disaggregate between those two things. So that's a potential barrier. But I think the real barrier are political barriers. And there's two issues here. The first is that land value taxes generally are taxed as a sort of lump sum annual levy. And of course, people don't like lump sum annual levy taxes. People don't like council tax. Margaret Thatcher tried the poll tax. That didn't go very well. Much better, I think, would be a tax that is withdrawn from income or is taken away in a less salient fashion, a less visible tax. We need to think about ways of doing that. The biggest problem is basically that the people with the most to lose from this kind of tax are those who run our political system or are at the top of are the 1% essentially. But that may be changing in democracies anyway, as more of us become renters. Or prediction is, I think, in London by 2020, 60% of people will be renting. So there are ways we could try and introduce a land value tax. One way could be to start off with a split level tax, where you're taxing both property and land at the same time, and then gradually reduce the tax on property and increase it on land. Tax neutrality is what we need to aim for. We need to be talking about shifting away from taxing productive activity and income and towards unearned income on land. And of course, one of the key problems would be those people who are equity rich but income poor, like pensioners. So you need to find a way of allowing them to delay their payments or to release equity in their homes to cover their payment. So pensioners could release equity to the state in this kind of land trust or land bank idea, for example. You could use the profits from a land value trust to give everyone an equal citizen's income. That could be another option to get round this problem of certain parts of the population being hit excessively hard by such a tax. I'll move on to financial reform. I think you might have already seen a chart like this earlier today, but this just captures the problem, really. This enormous growth, the blue line in domestic mortgage lending vis-a-vis productive lending, business lending, and the red line there, consumer lending, is the purple line at the bottom. How do we address this? Well, fundamentally, we need different kinds of banks. We have banks in this country that are focused on lending to existing assets. They are large, monopolistic, shareholder-owned banks driven by double-digit returns, quarterly returns on equity by their shareholders. We've lost our smaller regional stakeholder, what we call stakeholder banks, and we need to develop these again. So one of our major proposals at NEF is for the creation of to break up the Royal Bank of Scotland into 130 stakeholder banks focused on lending to small businesses and de-risking their lending, not via needing collateral in the form of real estate or mortgages, but from actually building relationships with firms over time. And this is the German, Swiss, Austrian model, where relationships are built up. And when you have that kind of strong relationship with a business, you're much more willing to lend them money when times are bad. So that's another option. Credit guidance is this idea that the central bank or monetary authority actually puts constraints on certain types of lending. In the 60s and 70s, it was very common, including in the UK, for the central bank to essentially tell banks you can only lend 20% of your assets against real estate because real estate was thought to be dangerous and speculative. Kind of lost it somehow in the 1980s. Macroprudential policy is moving in that direction. Finally, there's a broader question, I think, about whether debt contracts, which, of course, give a guarantee to the lender that the debt will stay the same, whatever happens to the value of the asset, in this case, the house, are the most appropriate way of financing mortgage lending. And that actually in equity-based mortgage systems would make much more sense, where the lender and the borrower share the risk, so sort of Islamic finance type models. And there's increasing proposals for that kind of option. Finally, because of the failure of mainstream economics to properly, and I mean neoclassical economics, particularly since the 1960s here, to properly understand land as a separate factor of production. It was conflated together with capital, essentially. So land was just seen as a bit like machinery that was mobile, that it wasn't scarce, it could be produced if more of it was needed. None of which are true. Land is scarce and it's immobile. That our national accounts actually reflect that misunderstanding, so that land is viewed and counted, very important, as a produced non-financial asset, when of course it's a non-produced finite asset. So we need to change the way we actually account for land in the accounts. And I think we also need to change the way we understand national debt, public debt, because public expenditure on physical infrastructure, and in particular on housing and affordable housing, is not excluded from public sector measure of debt in this country, which means there's no incentive for either the government or particularly local authorities to keep hold of land and build on it and get those revenues of income from rents. Because rather than being seen as an asset, which of course that's affordable housing clearly is, it's seen as it's just added on to that debt, that deficit. So it'll be very hard to reform and do all the great things that we've been hearing about at this conference unless we get these kinds of national accounting reforms in place. And I'll just finish with a bit of self-promotion and NEF promotion. We do have a wide program on I've just talked really about more of the theoretical, but we have a wide program of research on alternatives to the current housing system, including a lot of work on community-led housing, which my colleague Alice Martin is leading on, so please get in touch with her if you have questions on that. That's our website. And as Beth kindly mentioned, we have a book talking about all of these ideas, a sort of textbook, which we're hoping will be attractive to the general public as well as to economics students who don't get taught about land in their undergraduate degrees, called Rethinking the Economics of Land, coming out with Z Books in February. Thank you very much.